Functions are not something new. It's something we've seen for years, either in mathematics or in programming languages. The idea is we pass in some input, something happens, and we get some output. Well, when it comes to JavaScript, functions are a little bit different than most programming languages. They are, in fact, objects. And because they are objects, just like objects, functions can be assigned to a variable. They can be assigned to an object. That is, the properties within the object can take a function. They can be passed as arguments to other functions. They can be returned from functions. And they can have methods and properties and be created on the fly dynamically. So what does this mean? This means that if you pass a function, you can execute it as you see here. So let's go ahead and write an example. Let's go ahead and move to the console on the browser, and let's write that example that we had. So I'm going to go ahead and enter here a function called run, and it's going to take a parameter that is going to be a function that I'm simply going to call f. And inside of that, I'm going to execute that function that I don't know what it is at the moment, in fact. And then we're going to go ahead and write another function, and we'll call this one greeting, as in the example. This is not going to take any parameters. And inside of it, we're simply going to write to the console, hello world. So I'm going to enter console log. Inside of it, I'll enter the string, and I'll say hello world. That's all we're going to do here. And now we're going to go ahead and run. That is, invoke the function called run. And we're going to give it another function as an argument. And so what this is going to do is this is going to pass greeting, the function greeting, as a parameter, as an argument to the function run. Run is going to receive this function, and then it's simply going to execute it. So let's go ahead and run this. And as you can see there, we get back at the console, hello world. So as mentioned, this is something different than in most languages, that a function really is no different than any other parameter, and that is because, in fact, it's an object. The only difference from an object is that it can be invoked. But other than that, it behaves the same way. Now, with that in mind, let's go ahead and go back to our slides. And let's go ahead and move forward to an idea that's called callbacks. And the idea here is that when you think about language designers, they're faced with the challenge of having to foresee everything that one might need in a language. So it would be convenient to have some way of allowing the language to be extended, or for the language to handle a number of situations by the users providing their own function. And this is very much the idea behind callbacks. As you can see here, the formal definition, it's a callback is a function that is passed as an argument to other code. The receiving code then executes this code as needed. And so let's think through this, and let's take a look at an example here. An example with a list of numbers. I'm going to go ahead here and clear my console. Then I'm going to go ahead and open up a file that I have here called index. And now I'm going to go ahead and show you some of the code that I have added to this file. So you can see here that we start off with a list of numbers, something that we may want to work with. Then I'm going to go ahead here and provide a callback. And we're going to go ahead and use that callback to act upon this list of numbers. And so I'm going to leave that open for now to be done, as you can see there. Then I'm going to have another function called filter that takes a list and takes a callback. And we're going to write that in a minute. But I'm going to go ahead here and write out the last part of the code. And as you can see here, we have an invocation to filter, and we're passing in list, which is a list of numbers. And then we're going to pass in a callback. So as you can see here, we are creating a generic filter that will take a list and then a function that knows how to act upon that list. And the return from that is going to be a filtered list. So we are decoupling the steps with which we act upon this list, into these different parts. And you'll see later why we do that. But here we're simply illustrating this concept of a function that is passed that will be called back to act upon this list. So what we're going to do here is something very simple. We're going to go ahead and write here our callback, and our callback is simply going to filter this list. And so I'm going to go ahead and create a new list here. I'll just go all lowercase, and then we're going to have to walk through this list. And for that, we'll write a for loop, and this for loop is going to have a counter called I, which we will initialize at 0. Then we're going to loop as long as the list length is less than I. And so we're going to go ahead and enter here length. And then we're going to increase our counter by 1 on every loop iteration. Now inside of the body, we're going to go ahead and look for a condition. And this condition, it's simply of our own choosing. I'm simply going to say here that if the list item is greater than 5, then we're going to include it in this new list. And so then I will push a new item. So I'm going to do here push and then enter list and the counter. So all we're doing here is looping through the list and selecting those items that are greater than 5. Then we will return our new list. And once we're back in the filter function, here we will need to return that result of executing the callback with our list. And so now let's go ahead and execute this within the page. And let me go ahead and drag and drop that file. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And let me go ahead and open up the console. And let me go ahead and add one more line here that does console log and enters filtered. So let's go ahead and reload the page. And as you can see there, as expected, we get the numbers that are greater than 5. So once again, look at the observation that I'm making here. I'm breaking down the functionality into a callback, and the callback is acting upon this list. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and go back to our slides. And let's move forward to our next slide. As you can see here, the language has a number of ways of acting upon a list of things, a collection. And you can see here that there is one for filter. Filter takes a callback, and it does everything that we did ourselves, which is enumerate through this list, select the part that we want, and it simply focuses on the condition that we're trying to match. And this condition is that if you return true from this callback function, the item will be kept. That is, the filtered list will contain that item. And if you return false, then it will not. So let's go ahead and take a look at the code and see how we can write that. I'm going to go ahead and save this file here under index 2. And then I'm going to go ahead and simplify my code here. And actually, before I do that, let me go ahead and match the signature, which, if you remember, was array filter, in this case list.filter, and all we're going to give it is that callback, right? So as you can see there, that is the signature array.filter and then the callback. And now we don't need that intermediate function, and we only focus on our callback. And now one thing to note is that each of the items on that list is passed into the callback one at a time. And so we only have to make a decision on one. And so I will write here item, and then I will simply return. As mentioned, we need to return true or false. And so I will make a comparison here. Is it greater than 5? If it is, it's going to return true, which means we will keep that item. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and navigate here to index 2, which is what I gave that file name. And as you can see there, we get the same thing back. Now, if we were to change the comparison there, we should get the opposite. And as you can see there, we do. So as you can see, this is a lot more compact. It's a pretty elegant way in which to decide on how you're going to do filtering. And you can also do filtering any which way you want. This is a pretty simple here structure. It's just a list of numbers, but you can imagine you might have a complicated data structure that would require you to have a more complex callback. However, from a language standpoint, you would still do list.filter, and then your callback would need to include all of the conditions for which you would decide to keep an item or not. So let's go ahead and go back to our slides. And as you can see there, we did very much that example right now. So we can go ahead and skip over it. And I wanted to show you one more example of callbacks. As you can see here, the language designers decided that in order to do sorting, one more built-in type of functionality using callbacks, you would provide a function, and this function needed to have the following behavior. And you can see here the conditions that if A comes first, A is a lower index, and in general, what you would do is you would return either a -1, a +1, or a 0 if they are the same. So in this case, you can disregard, or not disregard, but you can offload the decision of how things are going to be sorted, that is, what algorithm is going to be used, to the language implementation, to how that would be handled. Your only responsibility in this case, as in filtering, is to simply provide those values. That is the -1, 1, or the 0. So let's go ahead and write an example to illustrate the use. And let's go ahead and create a new file. We're going to go ahead and save it as sort.html. Inside of it, we're simply going to add a script tag. And now let's go ahead and add a list of numbers. Below that, we're going to have our callback, which I will call compare. And compare takes 2 arguments. 2 items of that list are going to be passed in at a time for that comparison. And we're going to implement that in a minute. And below it, we're going to go ahead and sort our list. So this is going to be numbers.sort. And then we're going to go ahead and enter our callback. And our callback is called compare. Then once that is done, we're going to go ahead and write this to the console. We're going to go ahead and enter here numbers. And now let's go ahead and write our comparison. I'll go ahead and write it formally first, and then I'll show you a shortcut. So if A is less than B, we're going to go ahead and return -1. If A is greater than B, we're going to go ahead and return 1. Then the last comparison is if A is equal to B, then we will return 0. So let's go ahead and save that. Let's go ahead and point to that. And that is sort.html. And as you can see there, we get the sorted list. Now in this case, because we have a very simple list, we could simply do A minus B, and that would actually return the same values. So this is the shortcut I was referring to. That only makes sense in the context of the type of data that you have. So that's a brief introduction to callbacks. I should mention that it turns out that callbacks are extremely important on this platform, on this language. They are deeply embedded into most functionality that you will find as you go beyond the basics, heavily used in all the major libraries. And so this is one that you want to get some practice on, you want to develop some comfort, because you will see them heavily everywhere.